Welcome on behalf of the American Psychological Foundation, and thank you for joining us today for this APF at Home Fireside Chat. This is the first Fireside Chat honoring the 2023 recipients of the APF Gold Medal Award for Impact in Psychology. I'm Dr. Linda Forrest, APF's treasurer, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to be here today with one of our recipients, Dr. Joseph Gahn. As the premier grant-making foundation in psychology, APF awards over $1 million annually in grants, scholarships, and awards, supporting psychologists and students with the goal of making sure psychology is addressing the major societal issues and improving the lives of all. APF is unique. It receives the overwhelming majority of its funding from individuals like you who are joining us today. We are honored and grateful for your investment in APF that helps us continue funding important groundbreaking research and practice. As we proceed through the conversation today, if you have any questions for Dr. Gahn, please feel free to enter the question in the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will do our best to address all the questions at the conclusion of the program. Now it's my honor to formally introduce tonight's guest, Dr. Joseph P. Gahn. Dr. Gahn is an international expert in psychology and the mental health of American Indians and other Indigenous people. A tenured full professor at Harvard University, Dr. Gahn has collaborated with tribal communities for nearly 30 years to re-envision and reshape conventional mental health services to advance Indigenous well-being. Dr. Gahn is an enrolled member of the Aha-Ni-Grovant Tribal Nation of Montana. He also served briefly as the Chief Administrative Officer for the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. Honored with more than 20 fellowships and career distinguished awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, Dr. Gahn was the recipient of the 2021 APA Award for Distinguished Professional Contributions to Applied Research and is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. There is much more to say about Dr. Gahn's many impacts on psychology, yet today we are here to listen and learn from Dr. Gahn. Welcome, Dr. Gahn. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Forrest. It's a pleasure to join you, and I'm excited for our conversation this evening.
And me too. I'd like to jump right in. Your research is uniquely situated as a collaborative process with Native communities that you have and are studying. Can you share with us how you came to this collaborative approach and a little about what brought this collaborative focus to your career?
Sure. When I think back to being a younger person deciding on career paths, I remember really agonizing over whether to go into anthropology, into psychiatry, or into psychology. I had this epiphany in which psychology became clear for me because it allows room both for research and a focus on ideas and concepts, as well as the applied focus of being beneficial through therapy and counseling to communities. And so that's why I chose to pursue psychology. Now, I entered into a doctoral program that was a joint clinical community psychology program at the University of Illinois, where I got my doctorate. And this program was really fertile and generative in my own thinking because community psychology was a breakaway movement from within clinical psychology back in the 1960s and really sought to re-anchor how applied psychology could be done. It rejected in some ways what we think of as the medical model and tried to think about how you collaborate and partner with citizens to solve their own problems on their own terms. And it turned out when it came to the mental health issues of American Indian and other Indigenous communities, to which I was very committed to engaging and addressing, that this outlook and approach mattered a lot because Indigenous peoples in the United States are in fact in the condition of coloniality, which is to say that we have been subjugated and dispossessed of our lands and resources for a very long time. We occupy perpetually marginal status in this society. And so we have to attend to these conditions of coloniality if we're going to make a difference around helping for distress and dysfunction. And so it's been my career's goal, based on a very early research project in which I learned from an individual who in our work together went by his Indian name of Traveling Thunder, that actually some Indian people view psychiatry and the mental health, psychological and enterprise or endeavor as potentially ideologically assimilating and colonizing still, even in its effort to be helpful. So I had to figure out how to re-anchor what I wanted to do in a way that would actually be beneficial or helpful. And that's led me over the course of my career to most recently trying to articulate on behalf of the Indigenous people I've talked to and learned from over these past decades, what I call an alternative science. And this alternative science, first of all, alternative, you probably get alternative, but for natives. And science, by which I mean PSY science, as opposed to SCI science. PSY science refers to psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, the kind of modern approach to understanding human life and human distress that arose for the past century in modernity. And it contains a whole bunch of authorized knowledge, understandings, some of which are grounded in scientific data and analysis, but a lot of which are not, a lot of which are simply cultural preferences. And so this alternative science is an alternative to knowledge in psychiatry and mental health as usual, and it reflects Indigenous commitments and Indigenous concerns to various domains of interest. And just quickly, I'll say what those domains are. In the domain of distress, this alternative science, again, reflecting Indigenous perspectives and orientations that I've learned a lot about over these past couple of decades. Distress is not so much DSM mental disorders, but in fact, historical trauma, the legacy of colonial subjugation and its impact on distress and dysfunction. When it comes to well-being, it's not neoliberal individualism, which is to say sort of free agents navigating free markets in pursuit of wealth and happiness, but rather Indigenous forms of relational selfhood. When it comes to intervention, it's not the latest, greatest empirically supported treatments or evidence-based practice, but rather a return and reclamation of Indigenous healing traditions. And finally, even when it comes to something like evaluation, how do we know if an intervention works? It's less about scientific rationality and more about Indigenous ways of knowing. And so this alternative science, as I refer to it, is a parapsychiatric framework that resists and contests and recasts the entire mental health endeavor in ways that make more sense to the conditions of coloniality that Indigenous people today find themselves in.
Wow. You've just answered my next question in the answer to the first question. That was wonderful to hear, Joe, all the ways that traditional Western psychology is so different from the approaches that are more effective for Native communities. And it's wonderful to see the creativity in your work and the output that's making a difference for Native people. Something that all of your nomination and support letter writers mentioned was your impressive ability to maintain a high level of academic rigor while representing and advocating for Native communities. Could you share your experience blending these two things?
Well, sure, I'd be happy to reflect on that a bit. I think first and foremost, the work that I do depends an awful lot of and seeks to emphasize and center Indigenous knowledges, practices, orientations, ways of being, etc. And so in all of my work, I tend to focus very locally from the ground up on particular modes of Indigenous life, thought, and well-being. And so everything I do tries to get close and personal around a particular community's ways of being. And that becomes a way of opening out then to bigger questions and bigger concerns and trying to think through in creative ways what alternative approaches might look like. But the problem in Indigenous work, if we don't start very locally and in a very grounded fashion with real life approaches, is it starts to sound a lot like New Age claptrap. A lot of, quasi-spiritual religious sounding stuff that's very generic. And so I really make it a point in my work to be very close and up front with community life in this way. Then based on that, I try to branch out. And one way I've done that is in my academic work, to travel in interdisciplinary circles. I'm obviously a psychologist, but I've been a card-carrying member of the American Anthropological Association since I was a graduate student. My entire career has reflected this kind of interdisciplinarity. My first faculty appointment was at the University of Chicago in the Committee on Human Development. This is an interdisciplinary faculty group of psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, biologists, all thinking about the development of human beings in context. And it was a terrific opportunity to spend time with colleagues like that. In my 16 years at the University of Michigan, I was jointly appointed in the Department of Psychology in the clinical science program, but also in Native American Studies in the American Studies program, which of course is a humanities field, not a social science. And so that kind of multidisciplinary stretching has been a big part of my own preparation and career journey. And now at Harvard, I'm stretching even further. I'm in an anthropology department in arts and sciences, and I'm in global health and social medicine in the medical school. And so, these sorts of positions and appointments reflect the mix of ideas and approaches and ways of making knowledge that I bring to bear in light of the grounded, up close cultural practices of our communities. And it also, I think, stems from my contributions, stems from a bit of my understanding about the role of scholars and scholarship. So I'm someone who thinks that ideas can matter a lot. It doesn't mean they always do matter a lot, but they can matter a lot. And I think the job of a scholar is in part to try to advance ideas in as sophisticated, nuanced, and complicated ways as possible. It's our job to complicate received understandings and stock narratives and accepted approaches, and to try to unsettle those, to try to refine those, to try to maybe improve them or maybe discard them. And what that has meant in my career is that I tend to be unsettling for all of my audiences. And that can include Indigenous audiences. I try to say how things that I see and call it how I encounter it with some honesty and try to keep some integrity around keeping complex, nuanced narratives about the phenomena we are concerned with. And one challenge is that complex, nuanced narratives are not the stuff of politics. So I do sometimes see that although we have really important political ends that we need to reach as Indigenous peoples in this society, I think we can continue to reach them even with sophisticated, complex ideas, but it's hard sometimes to convince other people that that's the way to go.
So how has the interdisciplinary nature of your research and your practice affected, and how do you think about new approaches to meet Indigenous communities' needs from that interdisciplinary perspective? So how's that changed the approach?
Yeah, I mentioned that I've been affiliated with American Anthropological Association for a long time, and part of what I have taken from the field of cultural or social anthropology that has been really helpful for my work is the complicated way that anthropologists think about culture and study culture. In psychology, we've been all about culture for a couple of decades, maybe 3 decades now. And of course, that's not always been true. I remember some of our most senior Indian psychologists who were really struggling to get culture recognized in psychology and anyone to care and attend to it. So I know it hasn't always been that way. Thank God they fought that fight and won it, because now we can think and talk about these things. But the way psychologists typically talk about culture is very one-dimensional, and anthropologists don't do that. Anthropologists actually tend even to be skeptical of a term like culture, especially when it's used like a noun, because it tends to reinforce the idea that we are hermetically sealed, isolated communities that are fundamentally different than the communities around us. And that's just not true in the modern world if it was ever true. And so now we really think of culture as circulating a body of practices and approaches and orientations that if you have an internet connection, you might get exposed to. And we have more or less awareness of, facility with, ability to adopt fluently, those kinds of practices for our lives, for solving problems, for making meaning. But the point is that they circulate and they're always in motion and they're always changing. And that's a very different view of culture, which means that it becomes very hard to operationalize that as a variable to plug into your statistical equation to see what you're learning. And that's one area where I think I've drawn a lot on anthropology. Another area that anthropology has contributed that's really important is a focused emphasis on power. And of course, we do think and talk about power, particularly in multicultural psychology, which I take to have been a movement that is fundamentally concerned with how power is distributed in our field. But often power is sort of invisible or off limits or not really fronted and talked about. But in anthropology, certainly people talk about power as well. So I can talk about conditions of coloniality and indigenous life, and I can think about interventions that have to respond to the way power has been differentially expressed in ways that harm Native people and a need to undo that harm. And that's all part and parcel, I think, of this kind of interdisciplinary wandering that I do. And I wander not just outside of psychology, but even in psychology, there are more marginal traditions. So, I hang out with the theoretical and philosophical folks in psychology and learn a lot from the way they think and talk about things. It's just so generative. Or I go to the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in psychology, where we think a lot about how to proceed methodologically in qualitative fashion to get better at making knowledge. Those are just two examples. Obviously, my home field has been, culture, ethnicity, and race, Division 45, where I've sort of come up, in my own career origins and been nurtured and supported and inspired by folks in that division a lot. So I think that circulating and being exposed to a broad range of ideas and then kind of bringing them back to the questions that animate what I do in my career has been really crucial to the contributions I've tried to make. And ultimately, I hope to legitimating and validating alternative approaches to the mental health endeavor in Indian country.
Yeah, well, that's as I imagine being in your shoes and what that would be like to be functioning like you're describing. It makes me wonder, are you ever lonely?
What a great question. It's funny because I have gone multiple times. I bet to 15 different conferences. So not just one time to try it out, but actually felt like there was something there for me. And yet there's no conference that I go to where I feel entirely at home. Yeah. So I think that it really does lead me to travel a lot. It's a bit peripatetic, and therefore I think it is a little bit lonely in some ways because there's not too many people in psychology kind of doing this sort of work that I'm trying to do. So I think there is something to be said for wanting more colleagues and students and others to appreciate this kind of approach to solving problems in Indian country.
Yeah. So you've addressed the needs of communities, not only on reservations, but you've also done it in urban settings. What are the unique challenges and needs that face urban natives, and how have you been involved in that work?
Yeah, so I have done work in a mix of reservation settings and urban settings, and urban settings do present some interesting challenges, or at least realities that have to be taken stock of. Urban settings by definition are multi-tribal. And so, I've done work in partnership with the Urban Indian Health Clinic in Detroit, for example, where there are over 100 tribes represented among members of the urban Indian community in Detroit. And so when you work on a project that in mental health is going to take stock of cultural and spiritual orientations and practices, suddenly you're confronted with a wide range of these kinds of practices and orientations, and figuring out which are you going to prioritize and privilege, how will you adopt them in some way that could matter. One thing we did in a longstanding collaboration I had with the Urban Indian Health Clinic in Detroit was to develop what we called the Urban American Indian Traditional Spirituality Program. And this was kind of like an opportunity through a very structured program of 12 sort of lessons, and Indigenous Spirituality 101 for members of the urban community who had never really had opportunity to encounter that. Some have, of course, but not all of them did. And the challenges of putting together something like that are, we centered it on the sweat lodge ceremony. The sweat lodge ceremony is widespread in the United States, more widespread than it was traditionally. And, in modern times, it's pretty much everywhere. And yet different, peoples practice it a little bit differently. It has different symbolism depending on where you are. And yet it's wide ranging enough that was the, approach that my partners there really said would be the way to go. And so we had to find, a local ceremony leader who leads those ceremonies to guide us into how to develop a program around it. And we consulted with him for almost an entire academic year to try and make sure we understood, the principles and the understandings that were important to him. So that's an area where in that notion part of the country, those traditions sort of predominate, and it worked out okay. I think if you were working in the American Southwest or the Pacific Northwest, there might be other traditions that would have wider resonance with those. Even so, you're only reaching some, not everyone. You're asking people to be willing to participate in traditions that may not be their own ancestral traditions, but to come with it an open mind. And not everyone can. And it's not for everyone. Maybe some people would self-exclude because it's really not their tradition and it might be more appealing to others. So that's just one example where these challenges arise. One other I'll just give from the same sort of project was we were trying to, sort out the problem of how do you bring traditional healers into healthcare for Indian people in an urban setting like Detroit. And what we ended up realizing is there's like fundamental trade-offs that there's no easy answer to. You either aim for maximizing one versus the other in terms of those trade-offs. For example, in a multi-tribal community, you have an interest in traditional healing. Someone's healing traditions are going to be represented and someone's aren't, just because you've got to find healers that do, and they do a certain thing from a certain set of traditions. If you decide to emphasize and work with that person, then that tradition sort of prevails. Other traditions are not getting the same coverage. On the flip side, if you try to mix and match different people coming and going so that a wider range of traditions are represented, then you end up not having the kind of relational depth that might be really important for participating in a confident, trustworthy way in these ceremonies. That's just an example of a trade-off. There's not a right or wrong answer. It's just a reality of a decision you have to make when you proceed.
Yeah. Wow. Just thinking about the complexity of the urban setting and all of the different traditions that would intersect, and how to think about both the practice and research in that complexity. I'm grateful that you have all that interdisciplinary training as a foundation to be able to handle that complexity. Yeah. Another question, the US and Canada have very different approaches to addressing intergenerational trauma and the result harm on Indigenous communities. How do these two different approaches inform and impact your research? This feels like it's a narrower question than the way that you've been talking about your work, but maybe in the example that you just gave about going deeper on a narrower question, we might find something new and interesting in your answer.
Yeah, well, I've been privileged to do research both here in partnership with American Indian communities in the United States, but also with First Nations communities in Canada, and have had a chance to think about some of these contrasts in ways that have informed how I think and how I approach these matters. A big part, I think, is recognizing the different racial dynamics or racial politics of the US and Canada. So in the United States, we tend to have a black-white binary that structures our racial politics. It's about African people being captured and brought to the United States and enslaved. And, a lot of how efforts in the United States seek to repair harm is centered on Blackness, anti-Blackness, and, the nature and conditions of the rise of America. Indigenous people can feature in that, and we do sometimes, but we're often secondary or an afterthought. One way I think about the United States, just as an aside, is that we're a nation that really was a racial project that was built on stolen African labor and stolen Indian land, and I think you do need both stories there to really understand America. The contrast with Canada is that Indigenous people there are the quote unquote problem population. That have kind of vexed, white settlers in that nation state in terms of like how to manage and what to do for a very long time. And so the stuff that happens in Canada is more directly related to Indigenous issues in a way that's not true in the United States by and large. And so Canada has a lot more attention and energy and resources going to Indigenous issues at the level of the federal government, at the national level, in a way the United States just doesn't. And so that's played out in ways when it comes to thinking about legacy and reparation. So there was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in Canada during the 1990s, which resulted in all these volumes of analysis and recommendation for what needs to be done in Canada to better serve and do right by Indigenous peoples that ultimately catalyzed into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we had for about 10 years here, not that long ago, which was focused specifically on the abuses of the residential schools and how to remedy that. It issued payments to former students of these residential schools based on the number of years they were in those schools, and more if they were sexually abused or physically abused in those settings. It's scarcely imaginable that the U.S. would ever do anything like these sort of things. It's just a very different set of dynamics. And obviously we have a Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who is Native and who is trying to get going on a boarding school assessment and evaluation that might catalyze into some kind of a recognition and reparation. But the point is, I think that, Canadians just have a different set of priorities around this. In fact, in the United States, we often get our Indigenous agenda set by Canada these days. So things emerge and arise in that national context across the border that then come across, and we pick them up and they become our issues too, like the TRC for the residential schools. Now we're talking about boarding schools, except there are some differences. I mean, our boarding schools were fundamentally reformed in the 1920s and 30s. The Merriam report came out in the late 20s that really condemned these schools, and a whole period of reform resulted, such that the schooling we've had, like in my grandparents' generation, are just not the same as they were before then. And so the issue travels across the border and comes to us, but it's a little bit different. Similar with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which you have women who were trafficked. You have like a pig farmer in British Columbia who murdered a bunch of Native women and fed them to his pigs, things like that, where then that comes down here and we're trying to shoehorn it into a trafficking situation, which I think might be true in some instances, but I've seen it shoehorned in situations where that's not really how it fits. It doesn't make the same sense that it did up there. So we get our agenda set in some ways. And I think it takes a little bit of assessment around how to translate and whether and when, and what other issues we might be being crowded out by that agenda in a way that we should be careful for and watch out about.
Having observed your leadership and mentorship in the Society of Indian Psychologists, I've been impressed with the incredible support you have provided to Native students and early career psychologists. Can you speak a little bit about your approach to mentorship? What are the important components of good mentoring from your perspective? And what are your dreams as you mentor Native students?
This is an area in which I've evolved as well over the course of my career, as you might imagine. Particularly when I was on faculty in a psychology department and able to train PhD students in clinical science. It was not very easy to attract and recruit Indigenous students to come do that kind of work at a place like University of Michigan. It's not about Michigan, it's about the training model, which is producing researchers. And I think one of the challenges is that talented young Indian people have a lot of possibilities for what they might do. And let's be frank, a lot of them are attracted to and end up going to become, I guess, doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs. Essentially, that's what they are, groomed and trained and want to do. Psychology is a little bit outside of people's range of awareness and experience, and research psychology especially outside of it, because at least with applied psychology, you can imagine going home and helping people in distress or dysfunction, and any of us who have families on reservations know about that distress and dysfunction in ways up close that we care a lot about intervening in more effectively. But research psychology seems like a long shot. So more recently, I was really honored by the fact that some Indigenous doctoral students at various universities, not my own university, were looking for greater mentorship on research. They wanted to know more about research. They hadn't got it so much in their programs, or they just wanted to know more about it. And there were 7 or 8 of them who, invited me to meet with them. So we began meeting. And so we came up with a way for them to get more research experience. One of the challenges of that is you've got research review boards at all these different institutions. How are you going to do original data collection? It's going to be a nightmare to do the bureaucracy around just getting all of the different universities to sign on for each of these students. So we settled on systematic reviews as a way to engage in a research endeavor that wouldn't get entangled in all of that. And we focused on suicidal behaviors among Indigenous people. And over the course of about 2 years, this Indigenous research group of these doctoral students, some of whom have graduated from now and are going into faculty positions, produced 5 systematic reviews, all based on this initial assessment of articles, and some focus on prevention outcomes, on prevention rationales, on risk factors, on protective factors, on the methodologies themselves. And so they're just amazing. And that's a highlight of my career, to have been able to work and support. It wasn't me directing it. They directed it, they just asked for some help. And so I did my best to support and encourage and provide feedback. But I think it was amazing. And that was just a fantastic way to think about this, because having a critical mass of Indigenous doctoral students in some of these places is just not realistic. And sometimes you really do want more than one person on their own. It's a really hard row to hoe. So, I think finding ways to distribute our mentorship across different settings with people, say through the Society of Indian Psychologists, is a fantastic way to proceed.
I think about the benefits of that kind of model for mentoring in terms of the relationships they build with each other, and that those relationships will be with them across their careers. And what a valuable resource to have at the beginning of your career, to have that depth of connection and relationship, and the value of the relationship building that happened in the middle of all of that just overwhelms me, just makes me happy. Okay, let's see. Given your amazing accomplishments and impact in so many different professional arenas, as exemplified by the story you just told, how do you approach the multiple demands and responsibilities across various faculty and leadership roles, besides being exhausted?
Yeah. There's a lot of discussion in academia, probably in psychology as well, about balancing, personal professional life. And I think people come into these fields with different interests and different challenges around that. Some people want to spend a lot of their time, I don't know, playing chess, professional level chess, or they want to go climbing mountains, and their professional life keeps them bottled up in the office, 60, 70 hours a week, and there's not enough time to go climb mountains. That's not really my experience. A lot of what I care about and want to spend time doing overlaps and sort of counts toward my professional life. So one thing to keep in mind is, I know that research is a hard sell for Indigenous young people, but the flexibility that academia affords for doing things you care about is kind of amazing. And, it's not just flexibility, like I can set my own schedule. If I want to be a night owl and go to bed at 3 a.m. and not have any meetings before 10, I can usually do that. But more importantly, it's about the substantive things I'm involved with. I want to be involved in an intellectual project of a certain quality or nature. As long as I'm a tenured professor, I can do that. No one's going to bother me about it, and I can make with it what I will. And so I think that flexibility helps a lot with, making sure that you're doing things that you care about. And as a consequence, I think the hardest challenge is that at some point you start to have flexibility. You start to see that you can do more of what you want, but there's always other people who want you to do what they want. Sometimes that's administrative at universities. They want you for this committee or that project. And other times it's just people who are enthusiastic about what you do, but want your help. And so the hardest part of the job, I think, is the always engaging with others who want something from you. But if you give everything to everyone who asks, you will not get the things you want done. And so at some level, it becomes the very challenging decisions around staying true to what you value and care about, because life is short. And if there's things you want to do, you've got to really adhere to the straight and narrow in some instances to get those things accomplished, versus getting, if you will, distracted by all the other things people want you to spend time doing.
Yeah,
and that's the challenge that we face professionally, I think, in this trade-off.
Yeah. So do you find yourself having to recalibrate as you get clearer about what you're interested in and the changes of the pressures that are coming from outside of you?
Yeah. Definitely. I find I've had to do that in major ways at different points in my career, but it's kind of an ongoing or running set of concerns. And I'm very fortunate because my spouse, who's a historian named Taya Miles, is an academic as well. And I can run things by her if I'm trying to think through this. I'm thinking about this. Maybe I'll do it. Maybe I should. Here's what it would look like. And she can go, don't do that. What a waste. Don't forget, you're trying to accomplish this. And that can be really clarifying in different instances. And so I'm fortunate to have that kind of feedback. The other thing is, very recently, I just, had my 100th journal article accepted for publication along with co-authors and so on. And so, part of what I want to move into is some books or a book. My spouse tells me a lot about I should be writing a book, and that would, between two covers kind of consolidate the vision and the lessons and the sorts of things. And I agree that that's an important thing to do. It is hard to get out of the mentality of, peer review, scientific publications versus a book, which, in psychology doesn't count in quite the same way. It's more about how can you submit, your contribution in a way that's a little more accessible to a broader public. And so, that's a shift that I'm going through right now, I feel.
Yeah. Looking forward to seeing that book in the future, Joe. Okay, let's see. Finally, something we've been discussing frequently at APF and of particular relevance to this award is impact. How would you define impact in psychology? At APF, we're eager to hear your answer and to learn from you.
Well, impact in psychology, I would suggest, has an internal and an external facing component. And I say internal or external relative to the discipline more generally. So internally speaking, I think that impact in psychology for the discipline might mean a set of ideas or approaches or recommendations that find some kind of traction beyond your immediate sort of circle of interlocutors and fellow scholars engaged in a problem. The challenge of Indigenous research, whether it's psychology or the social sciences or any other domain of academia, is that we're so small as a population. If you take the tribal citizens, maybe it's 4 to 5 million, of us in the country, which, is, maybe 1%, a little over. And so a lot of people who you're wanting maybe to impact are saying, why should I care about that? And so one thing I've had to learn about in terms of trying to influence the field with my ideas has been I never can only write about Indigenous stuff. Indigenous stuff is the foundation, but it has to open up to bigger questions, broader concerns, and wider implications for a discipline by the end of that article, or there's no incentive for people to really read and they won't necessarily take much from it. So that's the burden, I think, of trying to have impact in our discipline, is you've got to find a way beyond the very narrow, up close thing you care a lot about and a handful of other people might care about, to really reaching to the big issues that all kinds of people might think about. And we've been fortunate, at least in the kind of work that I do, to have those trends emerging in psychology. So, multicultural psychology was interested in this problem of how do we take stock of cultural difference and different cultural identities and really tailor therapy and intervention in a way that would meet a broader swath of the US population. Or how do we use qualitative methods or interpretive methodologies to make knowledge in psychology that, because it doesn't have variables and doesn't use statistics, maybe doesn't look so scientific. So what is its place and role in our field? And I feel like those trends have been almost like waves that I've been able to ride in my career, where early on, I didn't know, none of us knew if those were really going to find traction anywhere, but they have in really important ways. And it's helped, me to share ideas that I think have had, greater circulation than they might otherwise have. That's kind of internal, how you develop ideas and approaches and try to make them salient and legible to people in our fields, and to get a hearing and to get some attention, and maybe people learn some things and now they're equipped a little differently to think about something than they would have been otherwise. External, I think what we often want in psychology, particularly in applied psychology, is to make a difference on people's lives. And so how does the discipline of psychology, how do you work through it to impact everyday people? And, you know, obviously mental health services is one way to do that. In the work that I do and other Indigenous psychologists do, often it's about trying to open up the space for conceiving of what mental health interventions should look like. You know, the key difference between Indigenous approaches to the therapeutic in traditional cultural ways and modern counseling and therapy is the secular sacred divide. You know, I mean, almost all Indigenous approaches to the therapeutic are in fact religious or spiritual. They involve, you know, non-human spirit beings, patrons, persons that you appeal to in ceremonial fashion, for example, for health and help and long life in ways that can help people. And lots of Indian people value and understand the therapeutic in that sense. And yet counseling and therapy, not so much. I mean, there are, of course, like evangelical Christian counselors who tried to work out, how do I pray with my client, you know, but most counselors and psychotherapists have never even been asked to think about what to do if their client wants to pray with them, or if prayer should be part of therapy. And with Indigenous clients, I think that often is an issue that people have to address. So I think, you know, again, thinking through the discipline to some kind of societal impact means attending to and trying through the legitimacy and authority of the knowledge we make to break through the discipline into the everyday world in a way that suddenly people are a little more open-minded than they would have been before to alternative possibilities that would reach a broader swath of folks who are in distress or great suffering.
That's a wonderful answer. And those are very helpful comments, especially as APF starts another round of reviews and as we move towards selecting our 2024 Gold Medal Award winners based on impact. And I was just thinking, I think we're going to listen to the recorded session and this answer as we make the decisions about our review for the coming year. Thank you, Joe, for sharing your wisdom and your thoughts about that question. Before we turn to questions from our audience, is there anything we haven't covered that you would like to share with us?
You know, just by way of queuing up maybe some of the questions and answers to come, let me just give a couple of more concrete examples about how attending closely to Indigenous life complicates the mental health endeavor in ways that require accommodation or rethinking. Because I think sometimes it's an abstraction and we don't want it to stay an abstraction. We want people to have a really concrete sense. So I will trade in abstractions, but I'll try to illustrate them too. So one difference, again, not for all of the people in our communities, but for some of them, is the cultural difference around selfhood. And so we're used to thinking about individualism versus collectivism in psychology. I sort of prefer different terms to describe configurations of selfhood. So egocentric selfhood is more individualist, whereas sociocentric selfhood maybe thought of as more collectivist. And sociocentric selfhood is a big deal because it, to the degree that your resting, familiar, most comfortable orientation in terms of how you occupy selfhood is sociocentric, it has implications that ripple through your psychology. And so I think of in Indian communities, our traditionally oriented people especially, where, you know, in contrast to the Paul Ekman style, here are the 6 universal basic emotions, sad, glad, mad, those sorts of things, which are really decontextualized, the sociocentric self actually is likely to experience emotions that are social and to accentuate and highlight those. So I think of the great work of the psychiatric anthropologist Terry O'Neill, who worked in the Salish Flathead community in Western Montana, to find that, you know, depression was less recognized and talked about. Loneliness was the kind of idiom of distress for talking about the pain that comes from, you know, things going wrong in your life and not being in the right relationships with people and so on. Loneliness more than sadness. Or I think of in our community, sometimes you'll hear talk, especially in circumstances maybe of domestic violence or eruptions in relationship, of, you know, insane jealousy. You know, jealousy is a different kind of emotion. It's sociocentric in that sense than something else like it. And so, you know, we have a whole bunch of these. Compassion or pity. Pity is really important for Plains Indian religious expression, especially. You look up and offer respect, another kind of sociocentric emotion, and expect those spirit beings to offer pity and therefore help you in the response, and that colors human interactions and relationships as well. So there's a whole bunch of these kinds of social emotions. So, I think the thing that we need to understand is that counseling and therapy, as we're trained in it, often presumes a bunch of cultural orientations and modalities that don't fit all our clients, as the multicultural psychology movement has taught us. But one way that we often don't recognize is that it presumes a kind of psychological mindedness. The idea that our clients, and that all of us, in fact, in modern life, should be able to spend a lot of time looking inward, be pretty rehearsed at and comfortable looking inward to deep interiors that are richly furnished, to be able to come up with a self-life narrative that has a coherence to it and a direction to it, that we're responsible for like steering the self through life in a way that gets us onto like career goals and relationship goals. There's just a whole set of orientations about psychological mindedness that are premised on individualism, on egocentric selfhood, that I would suggest the majority of the world's populations are not particularly oriented that way. In fact, being oriented that way depends on a remarkable affluence. And the reason why some of our Western nations have this this egocentric self-configuration is because they plundered the world and had that affluence that enables one to just direct oneself through life in an unaccountable and disconnected way. And so these are all things that I think we need to take stock of in the work that we do, that we're not trained in our typical clinical counseling and school of psychology to really recognize and understand.
Yeah. A powerful distinction, important one for us to spend more time around the sociocentric understandings and what that brings to our interactions with each other. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experiences with us. Let's turn now to our attendees and their questions. And the first question up is, what efforts can we, I'm assuming this means APF, support that would be more inclusive of Indigenous populations, specifically focusing on the effectiveness of interventions?
I've been really privileged in my career to embark on partnerships with community members in different reservation settings and urban Indian communities to try to develop interventions that would be anchored on Indigenous therapeutic approaches. So I already mentioned the Urban American Indian Traditional Spirituality Program, centered on the sweat lodge ceremony, which was, a kind of Indigenous spiritual 101 kind of orientation. But another one was what we call the Blackfeet Culture Camp. This was a partnership with the Blackfeet Nation's Addiction Treatment Program in northwestern Montana. And the idea there was to invert the usual approach to cultural adaptation to mental health services. The usual approach is take a stock, preferably an evidence-based intervention, and dress it in beads and feathers, if you will, for Indian people. Try to change the symbolism, some of the language you might use to describe it. Make sure that it sort of resonates a little better with people's everyday lives. But you have to be really careful in that kind of adaptation, because there's an idea that there's a peripheral, sort of aspect to the intervention you can tinker around with like this, but you've got to preserve the core of the intervention, because that's what's efficacious, and you don't want to disrupt what makes it work. But I think a different way to approach this is to completely invert that approach, and to, instead of starting with the latest, greatest evidence-based practice, to instead say, what would it look like to start with Indigenous therapeutic traditions? And to cultivate those into a service or a program or a treatment. And then secondarily, as an afterthought, figure out how do you accommodate that to mental health services and health administration and those sorts of things. So that's what we did with the Blackfeet Culture Camp. I didn't come up with it. Blackfeet people came up with it. In fact, Blackfeet ceremonial leaders and preservationists and, cultural authorities designed what this should look like. And what it looked like for addiction now among reservation residents, was a camp that would sort of live something like pre-reservation ancestors lived. We set up teepees, we had pipe ceremonies, we had sweat lodge ceremonies, we visited sacred sites, we collected sacred medicines, these kinds of things that, have underneath them a deep foundation of Indigenous spirituality. So that's a way in which one can think out of the box and invert the usual way of doing business and try to think about what to do differently. Now, the challenge with something like that is you're never going to get, 500 respondents to do a randomized control trial to see how well it works. And in fact, the approach that you've done to tailor this very specifically to Blackfeet people may not be portable to Cherokee people or to Navajo people. So you end up with something that's very grounded in the particular setting. I think what generalizes in this instance is not necessarily the outcomes tied to the intervention in the way we usually think about them, but rather a process for developing an intervention that then can maybe have at least some outcomes that are fairly general. And so the comparison wouldn't necessarily look like the Blackfeet culture camp, but it might benefit from the same kind of partnership and collaborative development in a way that's tailored to remedying stuff like addiction. Now, what to do when you're not going to have large samples, when statistics aren't going to necessarily be that robust because of that, it makes it hard. And I think the ultimate thing to say is that we cannot simply assume that an RCT is necessary for us to know anything. An RCT is ideal. An RCT depends on assumptions like large samples that statistics would work on, and replication. Remember, we don't believe anything in science unless it's been replicated, et cetera, because we know replication falls off in our findings. And so, I think we need to recognize and make room for other forms of knowing something, even if it's not airtight and absolutely robust against any skeptical interrogation. We just need to recognize that, people telling you it works is better than people telling you it doesn't work. And people having lower symptoms over time, as opposed to people not having low, tells us something, that we can fill in the gaps here a little bit when the logistics just seem insurmountable.
Yeah. This is not a question, but this is a comment. One of our participants says they can't wait to read your book. So
I better get on it.
we're ready. We're out there waiting, Joe. And the next question is, as you are talking about sociocentric emotions and assumptions, I've been thinking about some of those basic presumptions. What about the big 5 personality characteristics? Do you think they are likely differences in that theory? Do you think there are likely differences in that theory?
Yeah, I haven't thought a lot about personality in this way, but that would be a fantastic domain for someone with his interests, maybe one of our up and coming Indigenous students in psychology, to take on. Because, I don't doubt that there is an Indigenous cast, an Indigenous coloring to, these different, whether it's the Big 5 or the NEO, PI, these different factors that have come out. Those, of course, have been derived empirically by and large, but not with native samples, right? And so it'd be very interesting. I think where I think it could lead us would be in terms of, for example, analogous to troubling the individualist collectivist dichotomy. I remember learning about individualism and collectivism, which is the old cross-cultural psychology back when culture started to become a thing in psychology. That's how people really construed and did that work. And it was East versus West kinds of samples that were studied in this way. But when I think about my own community, and especially in, pre-reservation experience, I don't think people were either individualist or collectivist. I mean, on the one hand, we had tremendous recognition and respect for individual autonomy. Just didn't intrude on other people. And if they wanted, if a man wanted to live like a woman, that was their business. You didn't intrude on that. The only instance where that would happen under certain circumstances where you would have a soldier society because you couldn't wreck life for the whole community during the annual buffalo hunt or something. But otherwise, a terrific regard for personal autonomy and people live and let live. At the same time that your sociocentric self-configuration is one in which your very identity is distributed into family and into relationships with other than humans and into relationships with the surrounding landforms, some of which are alive. So, some of these patterns and templates conceptually don't really fit. And I suspect personality is a domain where we could learn a lot by doing this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is, I'm new to these forms. Are there research, publications, articles that you recommend that describe North American Indigenous psychology and praxis as distinct from other Indigenous psychologies like Black, Indigenous Asians, Aboriginal psychologies?
Yeah, I mean, so this literature is a lot bigger now than it once was, but it has, of course, a genealogy, and you can go back to some of the early stuff, and many of these folks are still around. I think of Joseph Trimble, I think of Teresa LaFramboise, I think of D. Dolores Bigfoot, and I'm going to get in trouble because I'm not going to be able to name all of the amazing elders of Indian psychology who've written and talked and worked very, very hard, even to get like cultural difference recognized and to attend to Indigenous aspects of psychology and mental health practice. And so, there's a larger literature than you might realize. And I think you could pretty quickly pull together 100 articles. Sometimes I think we should have someplace, they used to publish books that were collections of journal articles in a field that were addressed to particular topics. I don't think anyone does that anymore because it's all available digitally, but then they're not collated and they're not commented on, and there's not in some ways the same sort of function available. But there's just a lot of fantastic work that has been the foundation for my ability to explore these topics as well, standing on the shoulders of those folks who came before me. And I think it's, if you type in Indigenous populations into psych info, you'll be overwhelmed by how much material there is. So in some ways, we have a different problem today, which is not maybe too little, but perhaps too much. And it becomes hard, like with everything else in the information age, to know what to attend to.
Yeah. So here's a question from Doug Haldeman. What kinds of cultural knowledge are necessary, in your view, for non-Indigenous psychologists to be credible and accepted by Indigenous people and communities?
I don't think of it as knowledge as much as an attitude. So, we're trained, of course, to cultivate and establish an expertise. And so when we work with people, we understand or conceive of ourselves as bringing an expertise to bear and trying to channel people into domains of helping that we're expert in. I think with lots of different people, and it's not just Indigenous people, I think counseling and psychotherapy are, not always the most obvious solution for working class people, for men. I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of differences for how we might best accommodate or adapt. But I think the most important thing is the attitude of being open to learning from and understanding and appreciating where your client is coming from. And in our neoliberal world, where the market drives everything, we have less and less time as clinicians and therapists to spend doing that. And it can feel like we've got allocated 4 sessions, 8 sessions, 12 sessions to accomplish this amazing work. And so there's not time for any of that. But if you don't have time for any of that, I just don't know how you can convey the openness that's necessary to be able to meet clients who are not familiar with therapy and who aren't going to take to it like a duck to water because of how they've been brought up in their kinds of orientations and practices. I'm not sure what the alternative is other than for it not to be helpful. And that doesn't sound good either. Those are some.
Yeah. Well, there's a wonderful comment to end with in our question and answers. It's actually not a question, it's a thank you. Thank you for sharing your experiences and continuing to forge the path for others wishing to expand the frontiers in psychology. This conversation has been healing and grounding. So what a wonderful comment from one of our participants. Thank you, Dr. Gahn, for making time to speak with all of us. It has been an honor to learn more about you and to celebrate with you your commitment and impact on the field of psychology. Congratulations again on a very well-deserved Gold Medal award. And a couple additional thank yous before we close. A shout out to Bethany Giblin for her great organizational skills and superb communication talents as our APF Communications Associate. It is Bethany that organized and planned this fireside chat. And also a shout out to all of the APA staff who do such a great job of keeping all of the APA functions running smoothly. Thank you also to all of you who joined us today. Don't miss out on the rest of our fireside chats. Resuming in January will be Dr. Eduardo Salas. Visit the APA events website page to register for these and other upcoming conversations. And as we say goodbye, APF wants to wish you all a happy, healthy, peaceful, and safe holiday season. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Gahn.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.